All right, let's talk about nationalism. It is, without a doubt, one of the most powerful and honestly most complicated forces shaping our world today. It's an idea that can build countries from the ground up, start devastating wars, and define who we think we are. So in this explainer, we're going to break it all down: what it is, where it came from, and why it's still such a big deal.
But let's start with a really fundamental question. Think about it. Why would someone be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, not for their family, not for money, but for an idea? More often than not, that idea is the nation. And if we can start to understand that incredible bond, we're well on our way to understanding political science itself.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll get our definitions straight. Then, we'll dive into the big academic debate about where nations even come from. After that, we'll look at the different flavors of nationalism. Apply all these ideas to a fascinating case study, Nepal. And finally, we'll grapple with how nationalism can be a force for both good and evil.
Okay, first things first. We have to be really clear about our terms. To have any kind of serious conversation about nationalism, we need to know exactly what we mean when we say nation and what we mean by the ideology of nationalism.
So, what is a nation? Well, at its core, it's a group of people who feel connected by things they share. You know, a common history, a culture, a language. But here's the crucial part. It's a political idea. This group either already has their own independent country or they're actively fighting to get one. And that brings us to nationalism. Nationalism is the engine that drives the nation. It's the ideology, the core belief that the nation, the people, and the state, the political borders, should perfectly match up. Its main goal is to push that nation's interests and protect its independence above everything else.
You know, this leads to this really brilliant concept from the political scientist Benedict Anderson. He called nations imagined communities. Think about it. You feel this deep, powerful bond with millions of your fellow citizens, right? But you'll never actually meet, see, or even know the names of almost any of them. It's kind of like being a fan of a massive football club. You're all part of the same community, united by an idea.
So, if we're all part of these imagined communities, where do they come from? Are they ancient things stretching back into the mists of time? Or are they actually a pretty new invention? Well, this is one of the biggest debates in the field, and scholars have been arguing about it for a long, long time.
Let's kick things off with this really provocative quote from a major thinker, Ernest Gellner. He says, "Nationalism is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness. It invents nations where they do not exist." Whoa. That's a bold statement, and it's really the heart of the modernist argument.
So for modernists like Gellner, nations are basically a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. The argument goes like this. As factories popped up, you needed a workforce that could move around and communicate in a standard language. So the state created mass school systems to teach everyone the same language and culture. And in doing so, they sort of accidentally created this new thing, a shared national identity.
But of course, there's another side to the story. The ethno-symbolist school, championed by Anthony D. Smith, pushes back. Smith would say, okay, sure, nationalism as an ideology is modern. But he argues that it doesn't just invent nations out of thin air. Instead, it taps into these much older, pre-existing ethnic cores, deeply rooted myths, shared memories, ancient symbols that give the modern nation all of its emotional punch.
So let's just quickly put them side by side. For the modernists, the nation is a pretty recent invention, born out of economic necessity. For the ethno-symbolists, it's a modern project, yeah, but one that's built using ancient materials. A good way to think about it is invention versus renovation. Are you building a house from scratch, or are you remodeling an ancient one?
Okay, so besides where nations come from, we also need to talk about the different kinds of nationalism, because it's definitely not all the same. And one of the biggest dividing lines comes down to a really simple but powerful question: who gets to belong?
On one hand, you've got civic nationalism. This defines the nation based on shared political ideals, things like liberty, democracy, and the rule of law. It's totally voluntary and inclusive. Anyone from anywhere can become a part of the nation by buying into those values. Think of countries like the USA or France. On the other hand, you have ethnic nationalism. Here, the nation is defined by stuff you can't change: your ancestry, your language, your blood. It's exclusive. You're either born into it or you're not.
And really, it's not just two boxes. It's more like a spectrum. Nationalism can be liberal, linked to democracy and individual rights. It can be anti-colonial, used as a powerful weapon to fight for freedom. But it can also turn dark, becoming expansionist and aggressive, or it can be intensely focused on preserving a single culture, sometimes at the expense of others.
and these forms often get mixed together in the real world.
All right, enough theory. Let's see how all this stuff actually plays out in the real world. And for that, we're going to look at a really fascinating case, Nepal, a country whose entire identity is wrapped up in its location between two massive neighbors.
I mean, just look at Nepal on a map. It's literally sandwiched between India and China. Being in that position, as a kind of buffer state, has been absolutely central to its national story and the kind of nationalism that developed there.
So what does Nepali nationalism look like? Well, it's built on a few key pillars. There's this incredible pride in the fact that Nepal was never formally colonized, which is really unique in the region. You've got the legendary reputation of the Gurkha warriors, massive national symbols like Sagarmatha or Mount Everest, and of course, the historical story of unification under Prithvi Narayan Shah.
But a huge part of modern Nepali nationalism is defined by its relationship with its neighbors, especially in opposition to what many see as overbearing influence from India. This is actually pretty common. Nations often build their identity based on who they aren't. For Nepal, things like border disputes or the 2015 blockade really stoked these nationalist flames, and China is often seen as a way to balance things out.
But it's not that simple, because things get really complicated when you look inside Nepal. The main national story has often been a hill-centric one, based on the Pahari identity. And this has sometimes clashed with the identities of other groups, like the Madhesi and Janjati peoples, who feel that their own unique cultures and histories get left out of that official imagined community. It's a perfect example of how a more ethnic style of nationalism can create tension inside a single country. And this brings us to maybe the most important takeaway of all. Nationalism, for all its power to bring people together, is truly a double-edged sword. It has been the inspiration for some of the greatest acts of liberation and also for some of the most horrific acts of oppression. I mean, the contrast is just stark. On the good side, it can unite people, drive movements for freedom and democracy, and create a sense of trust and community. But on the bad side, it can be used to exclude and persecute minorities, to justify war and even genocide, and to crush individual rights in the name of the collective. Look at these two images. On one side, you have nationalism as a force for liberation, fueling India's struggle for independence from colonial rule. And on the other, you see its absolute darkest form, used to justify the unimaginable horrors of Nazi Germany. It's the same basic ideology, but used for completely opposite ends. So let's wrap this up with three key things to remember. First, nationalism is a modern idea, but it gets its emotional punch from ancient myths and symbols. Second, it can be inclusive and welcoming, or it can be exclusive and dangerous. It all depends on how you define us. And third, it's a powerful double-edged sword, maybe the most powerful one in all of modern politics. Which leads us with one last big question for you to think about. In our world of social media, global trade, and constant connection, is nationalism becoming a thing of the past? Is it obsolete? Or is it actually making a comeback, stronger and more powerful than ever? That's a debate that is very much happening right now. Thanks for joining this explainer.